introduce you to Professor Janet Miller, who probably knew Maxine better than almost anybody here, and was a close colleague of her at Teachers College. Janet, welcome. You have to unmute.
Yep.
Thank you.
All right. All right. Holly, thank you. And I also really want to thank Ruth and David, especially. But I'm delighted to be with you, and I'm also honored to be with you all today. And I thank the whole Maxine Greene Foundation for this opportunity to join together today. What I'm already feeling is Maxine's spirit with us constantly, and I think my own sense of her being with us is that it will just continue to grow across these 2 days together. So I know that we're gathered together, and I have one slight variation to my title today, as I'm going to begin to share screen with you. I've now started to think about what I'm talking about in terms of Maxine's work. It will be based on what I'm going to call our 1970s encounters, our collaborative biography, and Maxine's abiding commitments to existential phenomenology as means of doing philosophy. So I've embellished my title a little bit. So I'll open with a little vignette. One afternoon, I was at Maxine's apartment as the mail was delivered to her, and inside was a letter from a student, a current student of hers at Teachers College. And he was complaining about Maxine's language. He said to her in this letter, "You are too complicated. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't understand. And so I think you should try to be more simple in your language." And so Maxine sat down and said, "Hand me a pen." And in her famous handwritten letters, she wrote immediately back to the student, and her opening line to him was, "Do the work, do the work. If you don't understand what I'm talking about, then go read more about Sartre and his notion of terrible freedom, agonizing freedom as part." So it was her constant theme in many ways. She was encouraging us all to do the deep work that really accompanies everything that we're going to experience and share together in these 2 days in the conference. So I'll never forget that vignette, because then she handed me the letter and said, "You're leaving now, aren't you? Go mail this for me." So I've never forgotten that. So I want to talk just as briefly as I can today about Maxine's absolute devotion to existential phenomenology. And out of this include her emphases then on how she conceptualizes doing philosophy. The concept of choosing is huge in her work, coming from Sartre primarily. The notion of project as well. As you know, probably if we had to name one person most influential in Maxine's thinking, it is Jean-Paul Sartre. So wide awakeness, another concept from another philosopher, a phenomenologist, Alfred Schutz. I'll talk a little bit about that. Freedom, and of course, social imagination, probably maybe the overarching concept if we had to pick one for our 2 days together here. And it really, Maxine always tried to use that concept as a means of really responding to philosopher Hannah Arendt's urging to think what we are doing. And that isn't a simple thinking, it's a very complex thinking according to Arendt. So Maxine really never wavered from the existential influences that Sartre in particular brought to her study of doing phenomenology. She always argued this way. She said, "We have to philosophize when for some reasons we're aroused to wonder, to really wonder, to question about how events and experiences are interpreted." Maxine always would remind us that we are constantly interpreting our own experiences. They are not an absolute given. Oh, this is what everyone sees at the same time, and this is how everyone experiences it in the same ways. Absolutely not. She's all about interpretation as part of her phenomenological approaches to her work. So the doing of philosophy, according to Maxine, really requires us to become more self-aware. We have to be self-aware, to look at our presuppositions, to examine our biases, our expectations, and so on. And all of these things underlie what we think and what we say, and what actually we think we know. And she's always asking us to question that, always do. So I'll try to briefly touch on these and other philosophical precepts as kind of a prelude to our complicated conversations that I know will extend throughout today and all the way through tomorrow too. So I first heard Maxine speak in 1973 when she presented an academic paper at a curriculum theorizing conference at University of Rochester in Rochester, New York, where I was studying for my master's degree. I had to stand in the back of the ballroom. It was packed. I was a master's degree in my first year there, and I really, in a certain sense, had no idea of what everyone was talking about. But when Maxine spoke, it immediately went, to my core. I could understand in some deep ways what she was talking about. So then as a doctoral student, I subsequently attended 2 more curriculum theorizing conferences. These were in 1974 and 75. And during these conferences, I heard Maxine speak in that gravelly, Brooklyn accented, mesmerizing way that she had, that we all loved. Hands gripping the sides of the podium, eyes often squinting above the crowd. She often would actually look at the ceiling. And it was, I think, this is my analysis of it, seemingly toward visions that she had for all of us as educators, artists, community activists, students. So although I'd been introduced to her scholarship in my master's courses, it was really those 1974 and 75 conferences when Maxine really spoke directly to me for the first time. And in 1975, she invited me to breakfast in the conference hotel, and I was terrified. So I thought, I can't do this. I can't sit alone with this magnificent thinker. So I sort of clung to my very large mug of coffee, and I tried to respond to what were really her rapid fire questions. Many of us have been in her presence when she would do this. Her questions for me, how difficult did it feel to be a woman entering into a curriculum theorizing field that's comprised mainly of white men? It certainly was back then in the 70s. It's been magnificently diversified since then, but there's still this underlying current. This is quite similar, Maxine noted, to her circumstances when she entered into academia as a woman philosopher of education. In a certain sense, how dare she try to do that? Many of you know the very famous story of when she finally was interviewed to become a professor in the philosophy of education program at Teachers College. They interviewed her at Columbia University in the faculty club there. And because that faculty club was then all men, she had to wait in the ladies' room until someone politely knocked on the door and said, "Come with us," and she was interviewed. So that's how she entered into academia. So we were off. Our conversations accelerated via phone calls and letters in those early years of our friendship. And then finally, these long distance exchanges were displaced when I moved to New York City. And by then I was doing sometimes weekly treks to Maxine's apartment. So really, having lived in New York City for 40 plus years now, I'm really retrospectively aware that Maxine and I accelerated the lengths of our visits and the frequency of them once I did accept my professorship at Teachers College. And that was the institution in which she had taught since 1965. But it was really, I think, those early initial discussions with Maxine and those early curriculum theorizing conferences that impelled not only my dissertation study, completed in 1977, of Maxine's writings up to that point, and her influences on what is called in the United States, the reconceptualization of US curriculum studies. It was those initial conversations that enabled, I think, all of that to happen for me, and also contributed mightily to my desires to continue the conversation with her. So I really can't detail or even really consciously know all the substances and nuances of our 40 plus year friendship. What I can note is that we did consistently express amazement at our differing abilities to address issues from our divergent generations, um, from our contingently associated academic passions. My professorship at TC is in the Department of Arts and Humanities, and I work with English, English education, um, also having sort of this combination major with curriculum studies, if you will. Um, we shared a deep love of literature, and we, however, had very differing social and cultural backgrounds. All of this was kind of twirled together in my mind with a lot of laughter. Maxine, if you were able to talk with her at any one point, you know she had a absolutely magnificent sense of humor. Yeah. So here, Maxine, born and raised in New York, in Brooklyn, New York, Jewish and relatively privileged, and me, a granddaughter of German immigrants to the United States who farmed the fields of Iowa and Nebraska. So these are very divergent, social cultural backgrounds, if you will. So what were the connective tissues, despite our multiple differences, that tangled us together in our drawn out meanderings? I think a dominant theme that I would be able to retroactively identify would be our incessant questions to each other about what it had meant and what it might mean to be and to keep becoming women academics. That was a point of real deep contemplation for us both. And it was obviously drawing from our own personal histories, but also histories of academe and our particular disciplines, if you will, philosophies, literature, and our, culturally, socially, economically, biographically situated interpretations of our personal experiences, which became really much further complicated the further Maxine and I tried to talk about all this in relation to our own teaching, our research, our writing, and so on. It got real complicated when we started to have to contemplate post-structural theories that greatly challenge Enlightenment notions of an always fully conscious self, for example, or a unitary and autonomous self. Post-structural theories do challenge that. It also challenges, depends on who you read, of course, but binary only conceptions of gender, for example. And so Maxine and I were able to listen to Judith Butler when she visited Columbia University and spoke. But we had to spend a lot of time talking together, Maxine and me, about Butler's contention that gender is performative. That is, it constitutes the identity it purports to be. So as we engaged in all of these, we began to tape record some portions of our conversations. So I have transcribed tape recordings of about 4 years of our conversations that happened, maybe bi-monthly, sometimes weekly, and so on. And we were doing it because we wanted to preserve our wildly ranging questions and observations and disagreements. We disagreed a lot about a lot of things. But also because Maxine had requested that I write her biography. And this happened a while back. And given my expressed major fears about such an undertaking, we sort of instead conjured a notion of a collaborative biography that would attend to our meandering wonderings and wanderings as contributing to components of what I would write as Maxine's biography. In fact, Maxine suggested in one of our recorded conversations, and this is a quote, she said, we can talk and then write, whether we change or use it or get the rhythm of it, because we have to decide on a sequence. We're probably going to free associate, so we'll call it convergences by two divergent thinkers. And then we'll see how and if we can weave it all together. In fact, all of the years of our talking, puzzling, constituted, according to Maxine, our own version of doing philosophy as Maxine's biography. that's the notion that entrances me the most, actually. So we when we were talking in all of these sessions, we went back through all of her books, her edited book on existential encounters for teachers, and then all of her 6 other single authored books. And of course, picking out themes is a fun thing to do, but also led us down paths that we hadn't anticipated. We spent a lot of time talking about her metaphor of the stranger, right, in Teacher as Stranger, a book that actually Maxine really, really wanted to update. And I really, and many others, wish that she would have been able to do so. So she loved the metaphor of the stranger, that has the vantage points of the unfamiliar, exploring our inner time and the inner subjective worlds. And she also said, though, the stranger, because the stranger has the advantage of the unfamiliar, right, that positioning, you still can't assume that that stranger will have any better access to the truth of what happened, so to speak. It will still be based on the stranger's assumptions about, epistemological and ontological assumptions about how one sees the world, right? Um, and so Maxine often spoke of consciousness not simply as an inner state or as only an individually focused an interest. Consciousness is always of something, never empty. So there's the stranger always being conscious of those particular vantage points, those landscapes. And they were unusual and difficult, not knowing the language perhaps, or not knowing the geography of the city and so on. So it's phenomenology, then, where Maxine found a way of doing philosophy that focused on the consciousness of one's lived experience, on life as one experiences and interprets it. So German philosophers are sort of the ones who are attached most often to phenomenology, starting with Hegel and then Husserl, then Heidegger, the 3 H's, right? And they were really trying to move away from analytic philosophy. They did so in very differing ways, and we won't go into that. But these were the philosophers that Maxine was reading in deep, deep ways. And instead of trying to figure out, or say what things are or mean, phenomenology is focused on the appearance of things, of phenomena. That's from the Greek word meaning things that appear. So what would appear to the stranger walking through the streets, and so on, things that appear. She was influenced especially by Alfred Schutz, phenomenology of the social world. And Schutz was really concerned about the fact that one could understand each other's motives in very typical terms, like we go shopping, we all try to get on Zoom, we make sure that our camera angles are right and so on, making dinner. And he was convinced that the phenomenology of the social world was able to be accomplished without entering into others' private inner sanctum or also reducing it to kind of a stimulus response behaviorist kind of inquiry. So he said, how we do this is through and this is his concept of wide awakeness, which Maxine adopted and expanded in mighty ways. But here's what Schutz says about wide awakeness. It's a plane of consciousness of highest tension, originating in an attitude of full attention to life and its requirements. It's active, it's not passive. Passive attention is the opposite to full awareness. And so this is also, how one creates and invents oneself. And he's challenging a very contemplative stance, by extending the idea of attentiveness to acting in and on the world. So you can see the threads of what Maxine pulled out and absolutely incorporated into her thinking. And so, she elaborated this in a whole bunch of ways, but she situated her wide awakeness, extrapolations also within the philosophical work of phenomenologists Merleau-Ponty, Husserl, Heidegger, Sartre, and so on. And she was really, really absolutely begging us to never do a form of passive attention that Schutz talks about. A passive attention is perhaps a student in in your classroom looking at you, opening the pages of the book, and yet really not engaged. And so indifference or habit, a meaningless biased rectitude. So Maxine, in all of this, in her attachments to phenomenology, was really drawn to what we call the continental philosophers, not the analytic ones, right? So you know these names, Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, right? And the person who is most influential in all of Maxine's thinking, of course, is Sartre. So he did combine some methods of German phenomenology, mix these, especially with Kierkegaard's ideas, but he also, remember, was a novelist. And this was, I think, the thing that attached Maxine to him so deeply, is that he also wrote and read literature. And so there's her connection, deep connection with that. And he wrote about what it means to be free, right? So freedom is the heart of everything for Sartre. And freedom to Sartre means you have to choose. You must daily choose to keep creating what will be, what will you do in acting in the world and making a difference to it, right? And so Sartre is saying we make ourselves up as we go along within life. You know, every day we must choose how we are going to live that day. And he also says that choosing isn't this passive attention. It isn't this habitual choosing. It is this going beyond, right? And so Maxine claims that whatever is chosen and acted upon has to be grounded in an awareness of what could also be held in common with others in a world filled with difference. If we need to go beyond the passive attention in order to choose in ways that are active every day, then we also have to be, as Maxine would say, how can we do that with others? You know, this is a not ever for her a solitary activity. You know, it's always in conjunction with others, right? And so she talks about sedimented personal history. She draws on Merleau-Ponty's of the theorizings of the precognitive, the primordial, in order to develop sedimented background awarenesses. In other words, what she's talking about here and what Merleau-Ponty is talking about is we are born into a certain social, cultural, historical moment and experiences, and we have some precognitive uh, embedded, embodied, if you want to call them memories of this, but these are constantly growing as we continue to grow and as we continue to age within our family and so on. And Ponty is really interested in how this gets manifested in the body and how the body is part of our understandings of how we are in and acting in the world. Maxine really liked that idea because look how it connects to the arts, the performing arts, the visual arts, all forms of arts, including reading literature, right? And so it's an embodied, always in the world consciousness, really could support people's willingness to look at things that they could be otherwise. There's that famous line from Maxine, to look at things if they could be otherwise, right? And so she continues to work this conversation, this notion of wide awakeness. She rolls in Merleau-Ponty. She's always working with Sartre, and these are all considered existential phenomenological thinkers, right? So wide awakeness and awareness of oneself as being in the world. I think I need to move up here. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And still remembering Sartre's notion about something still to come that we're trying to bring into being. Right now, for those of us living in the United States, and I would say elsewhere, perhaps around the world, the something still to come that we're trying to bring into being, for me and for many others, I think, right now, is democracy. It is actually Derrida's notion of the democracy to come, the democracy every day. We must work every day. So, she's working. Maxine works with all of this, and she tries to situate all of her writing and thinking within what Sartre defined as the fundamental project, right? The fundamental project. So I need to go up here, yeah. That's this compilation of a person's acts in the world. And she wanted to remind us that this is what Sartre talked about as an awful freedom. It's awful. It's awful in the sense because we are never fully determined. We are not finished. We are never, that's always her line, right? I am not yet, says Maxine over and over. I am not yet. All right. So this is an awful freedom because every day you must wake up and you must make this decision to choose, right? And so uh, this is not easy work. This is reiterative efforts every day, over and over and over. Yeah. So for such awareness as wide awakeness, it requires not only getting in touch and remaining in contact with one's primary or perceptual consciousness, but always striving to constitute, being condemned to constitute one's own meanings in and of the world. So Maxine, we could go on and on. I'm going to move up. I think we're going to have to move a little more quickly here, but if you can move up through the if you can read Dialectic of Freedom, you'll see absolutely magnificent extensions of this. And the idea then of social imagination is what she derives from all of this. She is again persuaded here by Sartre, and social imagination for Maxine requires daily choosing to reject the insufficient or the unendurable. Every day you've got to choose this. And how are we going to reject? What actions can we take to reject the insufficient or the unendurable? As a classroom teacher, as a teaching artist, in whatever our context it may be, social imagination really requires us to do these actions, right? But Maxine, especially later in her career and certainly after the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Centers in New York City and 9/11, she also began to interrogate ways in which imagination is not always benevolent. And she really wanted to be very clear that she was rejecting a sort of romanticized, always cheerful and benign notion of imagination as something that could do the complex, difficult, elongated, and never-ending work to repair. And so she, she said, they just simply cannot, these genial versions of imagination can't always solve the fearful social problems facing us today. And boy, I'm feeling that more than ever, as I know many of you are. They will not lessen the evils and the brutalities afflicting the modern world. So Maxine always argued that social imagination for her implied another order of thinking, responding and choosing in order to confront and work to change inequitable and figurative and normative violences. And so she's working toward a decent and humane way of living together. And she said she really, of course, thinks the arts and literature can support these kinds of interrogations for ourselves. And we must, work with the arts, especially as possibilities, so she would say, for self-confrontation, for increasing awareness of the multiplicities of self and other, for making individuals and their others more visible to one another. So it seems to me that in this conference that we are engaged now, that in a certain sense, Maxine's work is transnational, I would call it. I would think that we could say, because of the active participation that she really wanted, as rather than appreciation of the arts, for example, this releasing of the imagination absolutely requires that we also attend to her demands that we take action to repair, to daily address that which is harming perhaps others, and also ourselves. So I'm concerned about that as an extension of all of her philosophical thinking, in ways that she was really, really pushing us to take social imagination in the ways that Sartre intended it as she derived it from his work, taking action in the world so as to repair, to heal, to bring together. And so Maxine, it was never enough to just view or engage with a painting or a dance or a musical performance. and to talk about its aesthetic qualities defined by particular and often exclusionary disciplinary conceptions of such. She was all about interpretations that highlighted the unpredictable, the contingencies, the contradictions, even the absurd. She was most concerned with the unanswerable questions, right? And she would say, when we're engaged with the arts, we have to ask ourselves, what hadn't I imagined possible before this encounter? What and whose viewpoints might I now be aware of that heretofore I had never considered? Those are the kinds of interrogations, that Maxine wanted as part of our wide awakeness, as a part of our choosing, as part of our releasing the imagination. And so, yeah, if you could just keep going here a little bit more, yeah. Um, so we could talk about Dewey's crust of conventionality. She wanted to shatter that crust. It's the releasing of the imagination for fresh possibilities for social repair, recreation, reform. And so we can just move ahead. Yeah, yeah. And so I think this work, this is on a personal level again. I think all of this work in existential phenomenology really helped Maxine, as difficult as it was, especially in her last few years on this earth. It really compelled her every day to rise to the most difficult challenge, which was to get up, to choose, to get up, to choose, to continue, to begin yet again. It was difficult, and yet she did it every single day. And so I think in terms of our work together in this conference, I think we can take all of these concepts and know that doing the work of sort of delving deep into them would please Maxine in terms of do the work, understand where these concepts have come from for her and how she elaborated them. And then how we can engage together, I think, in cultural translations, if you will, sometimes difficult cultural translations, as a way of doing philosophy. I think that what this conference is offering us is this opportunity to engage in these cultural conversations that could extend and delve deeply into the ideas that we live and love with Maxine. And so a little bit more right to the end, if you will. Yeah. And so, I do think we can call this work as transnational, even though Maxine was a Brooklyn born, most often cited US born authors, for example. I still am going to argue that her work is transnational. It's both the global and the local, if we will. And I think that we can work together in these days together and beyond to create relations across these national boundaries, right? Even though we know that these are diverse cultural translations that demand constant interrogations of any kind of fixed binary categories, that become rigid, or local global, and recognizing local global tensions that permeate persons, all of our diversely embodied realities. And so this is what I'm hoping that we can talk about all the way through, knowing that Maxine herself was always working toward this every single day. I think Maxine's work right now is living, breathing, urging us to daily choose to thrust ourselves into the world in that phenomenological, existential way, so as to actively work for positive, constructive, inclusive change. I think this is the power of Maxine Greene's work. Thank you. Can you?
Bravo. Thank you, Janet. That was wonderful.
There's one chat they brought up, somebody mentioned Simone Weil. There was a question about that, and it looks like Gerald has a question too. Gerald, let's hear from you.
First, just want to say, my name is Gerald Mackey. I'm a professor of English at Ivy Tech Community College in Indianapolis, and this is my first kind of experience with the Maxine Greene Institute. Years ago, as a professional developer, we working with faculty in the classroom, and was walking around our local library, and for resources, one of the shelves, small book titled Existential Encounters for Educators. And I was like, wow, what is this? And opened it up and was just absolutely transformed by Maxine Greene and her work. And she's been a sounding board for me throughout my educational life. And I sought to try to share her work at my particular school and college over the years as we think about the work that we do in the classroom. Janet absolutely loved your talk, and Maxine loves, the dialogue with different thinkers, with Wolf, with, Nietzsche, with, Heidegger, whoever it might be. I was wondering, to what extent did she know about the power of what she was doing, of the influence of what she did? Did she appreciate her own work and legacy, and the ways in which she has inspired others?
Janet, I think you're muted.
There, is that it?
That's it.
Okay, great, great. Others would have, I think, a variety of differing responses to your great question. I would say that Maxine, I don't think, I think it would be a conflicted answer. It would be, she knew of her reputation. It was impossible to ignore, because when she would speak, there would be ballrooms filled with people, leaning out the doorways and, screaming to, let me in, let me in. She knew all of that. Of course, she experienced all of that. And yet, after every single time that she spoke, especially in a big conference, I'm talking maybe about AERA, American Educational Research Association, or AESA, or, all of these things that she was president of also, she would ask whomever she would meet coming down the steps of the platform or the podium or whatever, was it okay? Was it okay? And of course, it was brilliant. It was magnificent. It was incredible. And then the crowds of people would descend around her, and it would be difficult to clear the ballroom for the next, I think, I guess the best I could offer is that, like I think all humans, like all of us, we have conflicting feelings about our own beings in the world and the degree to which we may or may not touch another person. And so Gerald, I don't know exactly how to respond other than those are two sides. I could tell you one other little vignette. If you're in English, perhaps you would really appreciate this. I think you will. Louise Rosenblatt was a very large figure in English and education, not just in the United States, I think pretty worldwide. She was a little bit older than Maxine. And I see Tim here, so hi, Tim. And Louise Rosenblatt's son, as I understand it, used to play together, right, Tim? But they were both hugely influential, knew that they were. And so there was always a bit of tension, as Maxine said, about who was the most famous. And so it's just funny to think about, because and this would just be maybe for English educators in terms of, Rosenblatt's work, and hugely influential. But Maxine's, I would argue, was even more influential. But I'm obviously biased, so it's a really awkward answer. I think Maxine was not afraid to show what I believe we all, I'm speaking for myself, insecurities about her work, questions about her work, what could have gone further. She really wanted to revise Teacher, a Stranger and update it, which would have been magnificent, wouldn't it? And she would critique a lot of her work, afterwards. And yet, I think she's also quite aware of how magnificently influential it was. So that's a complicated question. So thank you. Yeah.
We have time for one more question. Does anybody else have one that's
Yes,
burning that you'd
yes.
like to ask?
Yes, Liz McKinley wrote a question and she's present. So Liz, from Australia, would you like to voice your question, please?
Yes, yeah, there you go.
Thank you. Thanks, Pam, and thanks, Janet. I just loved hearing your personal take on your relationship with Maxine and just the journeying through philosophy at that time, particularly from your perspective as women. Thank you so much for that. It's something I've always sensed in Maxine's work, and I loved hearing you talk about her relationship with Sartre and Merleau-Ponty and how she responded to them. And for the first, I've often thought about wide awakeness and the way Maxine talks about attention, knowing also that Simone Weil, a contemporary of Sartre and Beauvoir and that existentialist kind of crew and crowd, whether Maxine is aware of Simone Weil's work on paying attention and suspending thought, being in the moment, pretty much staying the same kind of sentiment but different language of force, wake. And I was just curious if you were aware of whether she had delved into Simone Weil at any point.
I think I know she had a little bit, but it's a really interesting question, given Simone's work, right, in terms around issues of being and becoming academics, right, and women, women, and the tension of not wanting the category woman to be a reified stereotypic, which I think Simone really delves into in incredible ways. And not wanting that to be a fixed kind of entity, but rather an undesignatable field of differences, would be how I would talk about it. But I don't, and I don't know why, it's something I never asked her. We did talk about Simone and we read some. I don't know why we did talk, I mean, and this connects in so many ways, Liz, to what you're asking, but in a way, maybe this is the way she got at it. In later years, she would talk about being upset with herself that she quoted only dead white men. And that is the case for, if you read through all of her books and her publications that are aligned with the years those books were published, it's only fairly her more recent work, we would call it, where she's bringing in issues of what we would call difference, as a broad thing. So I don't know, Liz. It's a great question. I can go back into my notes and see if I have any more specific, kind of feeling about it. It was difficult for Maxine to move away from the dead old white men. She really did talk about that was difficult for her. If you read through her books, I just finished teaching a course on Maxine's work, and we read all of her books, and so it's really fresh in my mind how often she uses Melville and Moby Dick, for example. I mean, it's everywhere, and it's extremely powerful in terms of the things Maxine is talking about. It never loses its, I don't think, its power. But in more recent conversations, she said, why did I do, why did I do that? Why, and in the more recent work, she certainly brought in Toni Morrison, et cetera, et cetera. But great question. I don't know. I can't, that's the best I can do in terms of, I think when we started really delving into more post-structural theories around, the non-unitary notion of the self and so on, Maxine was not fond of that. She's an existential phenomenologist, and so the self is, an entity, and especially the German philosophers starting out wanting to know the essence of, the self. existentialists move away from that, but she was still pretty much aligned with that. So she didn't, as much as I was sort of intrigued with all of post-structural theories and, reading and sort of made her read, go hear Judith Butler, with me. And maybe that's a reason, because Simone, I think, was moving more in those theoretical directions that would, I think, made Maxine a little uncomfortable. So,
Thank you.
yeah, incomplete answer. Thank you. Yeah.
We are what we are not yet. Thank you so much, Jenna, for this rich sort of delving into Maxine's philosophy and ways of thinking. It's got us to a great start, and you're very generous to share that.